Good morning. My name is Deepak Premkumar, and I'm a research fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program featuring the findings of PPIC's latest report, Are Younger Generations Committing Less Crime? The report, the technical appendices, policy brief, and slides from today's briefing can be found on our website at ppic.org. This research and event have received funding from Arnold Ventures. We'd like to thank them for their support. For today's program, my colleague, Magnus Lofstrom, will present some of the main findings and key takeaways from the report. He'll then be joined by Brandon Martin, and together they'll answer questions from our virtual audience. If you have a question for our report authors, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen. That is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. I'd now like to welcome my co-author on this report, Policy Director and Senior Fellow, Magnus Lofstrom.
Thank you, Deepak. Really appreciate that. So let me start here by sharing my screen here. So what we're doing here is, as Deepak said, we're looking at and we're sharing with you this most recent report of ours, Are Younger Generations Committing Less Crime? So I want to also take this time to thank you for joining us here today and giving us this opportunity to share this research with you. This is joint work with Deepak as well as Brandon Martin. And as Deepak mentioned, we want to acknowledge the financial support from Arnold Ventures. And before we get into looking and trying to answer this particular question, what I want to do is I want to share with you a longer term perspective of crime trends in California, and they mirror pretty much what we're seeing in the rest of the country as well. And I'm sure that many of us are aware of some recent uptick in some crime, and we see that here. The data I'm showing spans the entire period from 1960 to 2022. And I'm showing you the violent and the property crime rate. And we see some uptick in the last year or so in property crime, and we've also seen some increases in violent crime over these last 2 years. But from a longer term historical perspective, even with those upticks, crime rates are quite low, and they're part of a longer term broad downward decrease starting in the 1980s for property crime and in the early 1990s for violent crime. And as I said, even we've had these recent increases, violent crime rates and property crime rates from an historical perspective are quite low and part of a longer, broader trend. And so there is some recent research that looks at crimes and arrests that are finding that these patterns seems to be driven by juveniles and young adults. And that includes some of the work that we've done here at PPIC a number of years ago, looking at arrests. And it can also be seen in other parts of the country, looking at national statistics as well. So that brought us to this question of whether these patterns represent younger generation being less likely to be criminal active than past generations. So that's the question that we're trying to answer here. And we are fortunate enough to have access to unique data from the California Department of Justice's automated criminal history system. And what we have information on here are all the arrests that are reported into this system between 1980 and 2020. For much of the presentation here and also in the report, we won't spend too much time talking about 2020 due to its highly unique and different period in our history. So a lot of times we'll treat 2019 as the most recent year that we're analyzing here. And the first challenge that we face is determining how we're going to measure criminal offending. And what we use in this report is violent felony arrests. And our motivation for using this particular measure is that we believe that it's a reasonable, close approximation of criminal offending that isn't picking up or greatly influenced by some other key factors. And that includes here in California over the last 10, 15 years, we have passed a number of criminal justice reforms, and these reforms have not targeted directly violent felonies. So it's, at least from that perspective, these are not directly affected by the criminal justice reforms. And the other part is that arrests, since we're focusing on arrests, is subject to some law enforcement discretion. But by focusing on the most serious felonies here, the most serious crimes, violent felonies, this includes aggravated assaults, domestic violence, and robberies and murder, for example. These are the types of offenses that are typically where an arrest is much less subject to discretion of law enforcement. So we feel like this is a measure that in a reasonable way captures criminal offending. But of course, it is limited to violent felonies, and it means that our findings and conclusions, they may not apply to other types of offenses. And to answer this question, whether there are generational shifts in criminal offending, we're going to do this through the age-crime relationship, looking at, partly at least, through something called the age-crime curve. And the age-crime curve describes how criminal offending changes throughout our life with age. And what has been seen and has been described as one of the most robust relationships in criminology is that crime increases in adolescence. It peaks in the late teens or early 20s and then continually decreases. And contributing factors to these very robust patterns are brain developments, especially relevant for adolescents and young adults, that are affecting decision-making and risk-taking. We have physical aging that's happening later in life, but also life course events like employment. We have marriage, having children, income, and other factors that are contributing to this seen as a very robust patterns between age and crime. It doesn't mean that the age crime curve doesn't change. As I'm going to show, there are some changes here, but broadly, this relationship with age and crime is seen as rather robust, but it is potentially affected by a number of things, and including, of course, the generational changes are focused here. And what we mean by that are changes that are specific to individuals born at a particular point in time or birth cohorts that carries with them throughout their lives. But it's also subject to broader changes, broader societal changes that are not unique to any particular age group or any particular generation necessarily. So we may want to think of an example of that as the crime surge that California and the nation experienced in the 1980s and through the early 1990s that had broad impacts and wasn't simply affecting one particular age group or birth cohort. And then there is the age-crime relationship itself that could change, although, as I mentioned, this is seen as a rather robust one with a very long history that describes this kind of relationship as I just did. Depending on the measure we're using, we could see some effects from age composition that changes in the demographic ages of individuals over time. So if we take now a look at these age crime curves in California, what I'm showing you here are three of them from 1990, 2000, and 2010. And this figure shows you what the violent felony arrest rate is. So that's the number of violent felony arrests per 100,000 individuals of a particular age. And what we see here is exactly the pattern that I described. We see these increases through adolescence, and then we see some peaks around the late teens or early 20s, and then continually decrease. And we're also seeing some shifts here. So this is the 1990, and then 2000 into 2010. And what we're seeing are some shifts down here that represent some broader changes, essentially as we're coming out of that surge in crime that ended in the in the early 1990s. So you see a big difference here between the age crime curve between 1990 and 2010, but it's simply a shift downwards. If we fast forward now and take a look at a more recent age crime curve, we see very different patterns. And what we see in particular are notable drops in offending amongst juveniles and young adults as well. That this really, the changes that we're seeing here are really concentrated in this age group here. And then we're not seeing as much of a change here. And another thing when we're looking at this particular figure here is it gives us a misleading suggestion that crime would increase all the way throughout the 20s if these changes are actually driven by generational changes. So this here is our first kind of indication that, yeah, there might be some generational changes, but other factors could be driving these this pattern. So the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the composition of individuals who are arrested for violent felonies by age group. So in this case, I'm going to show you 3 age groups. So in orange here, we have 18 to 22, in black, 23 to 27, and then in light gray, 28 to 32. And what we're doing here, and for much of the rest of analysis, I'm going to focus on adult criminal offending. And that's primarily because we're not entirely sure of the consistency in reporting of juvenile arrests over such a long time period that we're looking at here. So for each of these, the percentages that you see, they represent the share of adult arrests that are committed by a particular age group. So we see here for 1999 that 24% of adult arrests were by the youngest adult group, 18 to 22. See the same percentage in 2004, and then we see a slight increase to 27% in 2009. And this, though, is partly represented by, or contributing to this, is really that we have a broader change in the age composition of the population, that between these years, we actually saw an increase in the overall population of individuals who are between 18 and 27. So that partly contributed to this. But then importantly for the work that we're doing here, then we see a very notable drop in this share where it goes from 27% to 16% of adult offending being represented by the youngest adult age group that we're looking at here. And unlike this change here, this is not driven by a decrease in the youngest adult population, those between 18 and 22, because between 2009 and 2019, we're actually seeing an increase in 18 to 22-year-olds in California over this period of time. So again, we have another strong suggestion here. There's something unique that's happening in more recent year, especially to younger individuals. But again, this is subject to age composition. So the next thing we do is I'm going to present this slightly differently. I'm going to show the violent felony arrest rate by 3 age groups. So 18-year-olds, 25-year-old, and 30-year-olds for a period from 1990 through 2020. And we see, first of all, here, we see that pattern that we have the higher criminal offending rates among the youngest individuals here, 18-year-olds, and then you have higher violent felony arrest rate here for 25-year-olds compared to 30-year-olds. So that's completely consistent with everything that we've shown before. And then we also see that these trends and changes roughly parallel, not perfectly, but roughly parallel, where 18-year-olds continue to have the highest offending rates over time. However, in 2008, if we look at the 18-year-olds, we're seeing a sharp decrease in this offending rate that is much sharper than we see for any of the other age groups. And in fact, by 2012, we're actually observing a lower violent felony arrest rate for 18-year-olds than it is among 25-year-olds. And by 2014, it's below that of 30-year-olds. So this is very stark contrast to previous paths. And then when we look at 25-year-olds, we're also seeing in 2015 that they start to follow a slightly different pattern where it's decreasing for 25-year-olds while it's increasing for 30-year-olds. And what these kind of inflection points where we have a change in the trends compared to other age group happens are really around individuals who are born in 1990. That's when this differential pattern is happening. So our next step is really then to try to determine, are these changes driven by generational shifts? That means that we need to take into account any age composition or age effects, as well as these broader period effects as well. And we're going to do that by looking at this violent felony arrest rate by birth years and accounting for those factors. So that's what I'm showing you here. And on this axis here is what those violent felony arrest rates are by birth year, starting with those individuals who were born in 1960. We've made adjustments here, statistical adjustments for age and period effects. And what we see is a quite notably flat line here for a long period of time that indicate that we haven't seen much of a generational change for a long period of time in terms of violent felony arrests or our measure of criminal offending. But starting in 1990, we start to see this change in the pattern where it's a very notable decline. And this here, when we move into individuals who are born in 93 and later, this becomes statistically significant. And it tells us that these individuals here born in the mid-1990s have a criminal offending rate that is about 20 to 25% lower than all previous generations of birth years going back to 1960. Since we're looking at the arrest rate here, which is really the number of arrests that are taking place in a particular year, in this case by year of birth, what could be driving that is a decrease in the number of individuals who are being arrested for these types of offenses, but could also be driven by decreases in the number of arrests that someone is being picked up on in a particular year as well. And these data allow us to actually break out those two components separately. And what we see when we do that is that the pattern that I'm describing here and showing you is what we see for the number of individuals who are arrested as well. So that suggests that, okay, this is driven primarily by the number of individuals who are arrested. And that becomes even more clear when we look at the number of felony violent arrest rates, anyone who has been arrested for one of these offenses in a year, are subject to by year of birth. We're not seeing any decreases. We don't see any big generational changes. In fact, we see something that hints at possibly an increase with year of birth. When we look at this a little bit closer, we see that it's not driven by any particular age group. It's part of a broader trend where a slight increase in the number of arrests per year for an individual who's arrested. And when we look at this then by calendar years, now I'm switching from birth year to calendar year here, looking at the period from 1980 through 2020, what we see is that for most of the years from 1980 to around 2010, it's hovered around 1.1 violent felony arrests per year for any individual who's been arrested for one of these offenses in a year to about 1.09. So it's a relatively narrow band. But then in the last few years, we're seeing a gradual uptick in that. And it's about 5% higher in more recent year compared to this longer period of time. So it goes back about a decade or so, this increase. And our objective with this paper is not so ambitious to try to understand why there would be generational changes. Our objective here is to establish whether they happen or not using this measure of criminal offending felony violent arrest rates. But we do take a look at some other measures of risky behavior to determine, to have a sense of, is it limited to the criminal justice system or is it part of some potentially broader changes? And so when we look at teen behavior, we're seeing that there are some changes that line up quite closely in terms of when do they happen with our criminal offending felony violent arrest rates. What I'm showing you in this particular graph is alcohol consumption. And specifically for 12th graders, we're using binge drinking as well as regular alcohol consumptions data from CDC, national data. And what we see, again, we see some variation across years, but starting in the mid-2000s, it starts a notable decrease. So especially here, what is most notable in this one is the binge drinking. We see a very similar pattern if we extend this to looking at drug use. We also see it in terms of another risky teen behavior that would be unprotected sex when we are using teenage birth as our measure of that, again, lining up very closely with what we're seeing for a felony violent arrest rate. So they're not, the patterns that we are seeing in the criminal justice system are not necessarily unique to the criminal justice system. And then we also look at teen use of time. And what we're seeing there are big changes as well that coincide roughly with the changes that we're seeing for these broader changes in risky behavior. And what I'm talking about there is an increased use of computers as well as smartphones. So screen time is increasing notably over the last 15 years compared to before. And there's also data that's showing that there are decreases, very notable decreases in in-person socializing amongst teens as well. And while that in-person socializing might have some negative impacts on teens, one of the impacts might be that this also is leading to less risky behavior as measured by the various factors or outcomes that we're looking at here. All right, so let me wrap this up. So some of the key findings that we are finding in this report is this very notable change in criminal offending using our measured violent felony arrest rates for young adults. If we're looking at these between 18 and 22, what we've seen is that they dropped by more than 50% over the last 25 years. And that's not consistent with some of the other age groups. And most of this drop is actually in the last 10 years when other age groups have had increases. So that's very notable. Strong hint that we are truly looking at generational shifts. And we show that these shifts, generational shifts in criminal offending, starts with the generation born in the early 1990s. The drop that we estimate here is a drop of about 20 to 25% in criminal offending compared to earlier generations, and that this is driven by fewer individuals who are arrested for violent felonies. And importantly, though, we're also seeing that the number of offenses each individual is arrested for in a year has increased by about 5%. And this is not limited to the most recent generation. So that represents a broader trend as well. So even though we can't pinpoint what is behind these changes, there are still some key policy implications. First of all, the good news, generational shifts, decreases in crime suggest the possibility of lower future capacity needs for our criminal justice systems. That includes law enforcement, to our courts, as well as to our correctional systems. So that's the good news. But there are some hints of some potential challenges as well, and that is the frequency of offending being up. And what it might suggest is that we need to look for different approaches to reduce crime among what could possibly be a more challenging to rehabilitate offender population. And this is particularly relevant for counties as the state has shifted correctional responsibilities down to the counties with realignment as well as changes to our juvenile system in recent years as well. And then lastly, but importantly, risk assessment tools are something that are very frequently used in the criminal justice system on pretrial detention, as well as determining risk of offenders who are coming out of a correctional system. These tools are certainly accounting for age, one of the key predictors of criminal behavior, but they do not take into account generational changes. And what this finding strongly suggests is that those tools need to make adjustment for generational shifts as well. All right, so with that, we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of our presentation. And so I want to remind you to submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. I also want to remind you to please include your name and organization when you're submitting these questions. So with that, we're gonna want to invite Brandon Martin to join me to moderate this Q&A. So welcome, Brandon. He's a research associate and also a contributing author on this report as well.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you for the great presentation of our findings. We do have a couple viewer questions, but we have plenty of time for more as they come in. So our first question I'd like to start with is a viewer from Sacramento would like to know what factors may be contributing to younger generations committing less crime.
Well, so it's a great question, and it's a difficult one. And as I mentioned, we're not so ambitious in trying to answer that in this report, but I do think it's an important question. I think that it hints some of the data that I shared here suggests that it's not limited to what happens within the criminal justice system. We're seeing changes that are reflected in other teen risky behavior. So it suggests that it's something beyond the criminal justice system. And that this changes in socializing screen time as much as we are concerned many times as parents about video games, computer use, and screen time in general, that those changes in interactions and socialization might have had one positive impact, including less risky behavior. So that's part of it. One could certainly consider and should consider reforms as well, criminal justice reforms, many that we've had here in California, as well as juvenile justice reforms. We've also had a number of those here in California. And to the extent that they may be contributing to the pattern is very unclear, but I think it's important to point out that the patterns that we're describing here are not unique to California. There are some fantastic studies focusing on a sample of about 1,000 individuals, longitudinal study in Chicago that finds very similar patterns. And there are studies out of New York that also find similar patterns. So that doesn't mean that reforms are not affecting the patterns that we're seeing, but they're part of something that goes beyond the criminal justice system, and they also seem to go beyond the state of California as well.
Thank you. We've received two questions from Jeff Reisig, the District Attorney of Yolo County. So I'll start with the first one. Is it possible that increased underreporting of theft offenses, especially by California retailers, could be responsible for an artificially low property crime rate?
Well, that's something that we're not looking at in this particular report here. We're focusing specifically on violent felony offenses as our measure of criminal offending. And it's partly driven by the possibility of the kind of scenario that the district attorney is describing here as well. We feel like this gives us a better measure that is subject to less underreporting, less discretion by law enforcement, and less subject to criminal justice reforms as well.
Thank you. He does have another question that is asking, have we considered any studies examining the consistency of reporting and property crime incidents in California?
No, I mean, it's a great topic. It's a great issue. In other work that we have done, we are looking specifically at property crime and changes in crime, especially over the last few years. We have a blog coming back to this issue of retail theft that does show increases in retail theft. If one goes beyond looking at simply reported shoplifting incidents by including commercial burglaries as well as commercial robberies. So we definitely have data that are pointing to those issues. We don't know the extent to which underreporting is contributing to any of these changes. It's a difficult thing to assess because the crime data doesn't speak directly to that, but certainly some of the work that we have done suggests that a broader look at a particular issue that becomes of concern, including retail theft and the challenging environment that some retailers are facing, requires a broader look that includes some other crime elements that the data do include.
Yes, thank you, District Attorney Rising, for the question. Our next question comes from John Bunton, Senior Advisor and Program Director at Council on Criminal Justice. His question is, does your data source provide insights into victim/offender relationships, location of incidents, motivation?
It does not. It doesn't include. We have information about the law enforcement agency that made the arrest, but beyond that, we don't have information about victim information or specific location of the event, unfortunately.
Thank you, John, for the question. Now we have a question from a viewer in San Francisco, and their question is, how concerning is the increase in the number of incidents individuals are arrested for per year? Does it offset much of the gains from the reduction in crime from earlier generations? And what might be driving it?
Well, that's another great question. So it's the first thing is there are a few key things here. When we're looking at this increase in the number of felony violent arrests in a particular year by individuals who have at least one arrest, is not unique to any particular generation. It's part of a broader trend. So the fact that we have decreases in criminal offending amongst the younger generation, we are seeing this broader trend that that might to some extent offset those trends. We haven't looked exactly what those numbers bear out. And to some extent, one might say that, well, based on what I showed there and what I said, it's a 5% increase, might not be of concern. I think that we do need to take this seriously for a number of reasons. One, it's deviating from a long-standing pattern. And also, we are talking about the most serious offenses here. These are violent felony offenses, meaning that we're talking about increases of several thousand violent offenses as a result of this. So it is of concern. What is behind that is a great question for future research. We are seeing increases that these increases are concentrated in the last 10 years. So plausible place to start would be to identify when exactly they're happening, also to break it out by not only looking at violent felonies, but coming back to the DA Reisig's questions of property crime and other offenses. Here we do have information on drug arrests, for example. Are those incidents and frequency of arrests increasing as well? And when do they happen? Would start to give us some information about what could potentially be contributing to these patterns.
Thanks, Magnus. Our next question is, these trends largely focus on the pre-pandemic period. How do you think things have changed since then, especially with the spike in some violent crimes since the start of COVID?
Yeah, another great question. It's first of all, so our data, it does run through 2020, but as I mentioned, to a large extent, we are not looking specifically at 2020 because it was a highly unusual year. We've seen changes in arrests and bookings and crimes and a number of other broader impacts. So that's as far as our data goes. If we fast forward a few years, 2022 is the most recent year we have crime data for. We are indeed seeing some increases. And from a broader perspective, and to the extent that our findings are robust to this post-pandemic period is unclear, and it certainly should be part of future work, is to establish whether we are seeing some changes to these generational shifts, or is that decreasing trend continuing? Is it halting? Is it reversing in any sense? So that's certainly a good question for future research. But I also think that these broader patterns that we're describing are part of much bigger changes in crime than what we have seen in these last few years. So hard to tell, certainly should be subject to future research, as should to what extent do these patterns hold for other offenses.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Sean Nadeau at the California State Assembly, and he asked, can you please describe what you define as a violent felony? Are they offenses listed as a violent felony in the California Penal Code, crimes included in the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, something else?
Yeah, no, that's another great question, clarifying question, and an important one because of California having a very specific definition of what constitutes a violent offense. We are not using that more restrictive definition that is part of our penal code of a violent offense. We include a much broader violent offenses than the penal code. And the most common violent offenses that our measure captures are really, it's domestic violence, it's aggravated assault, it's robbery, it is also child abuse. But it does include some of the more notable exceptions to the penal code definition in California of violent offenses. So we're using a broader measure in this report.
Thanks, Magnus. Thanks, Sean. And I just want to add too, I believe there's a table in the technical appendix that gives the top sort of 20 violent offenses that we see in the data.
Exactly.
Thanks. Yeah. And so for our next question, someone from the Bay Area as well, what should policymakers consider with the insights from this report?
Well, I think you know, one key thing is looking ahead. You know, we're looking at the criminal justice system, our correctional systems, planning ahead. What it's suggesting is that we might have less needs down the road. It certainly is some indication of that, which is, you know, whether these patterns are holding up in the future is going to be key for future research, but it's certainly suggesting that real possibility. So that's in terms of planning and building up capacity. This is something that should be taken into account. I think the fact that we're finding some indication of some challenges that are not generational, but are broader, and that is the frequency in offending, that suggests that counties might be in a more challenging position today, given the shift in responsibility from the state to the counties with realignment, with juvenile justice changes in the more recent years as well. So monitoring, ensuring that counties are in a position to address these challenges are certainly key. And lastly, it is coming back to the fact that risk assessment tools are widely used within the criminal justice system. They're used for pretrial detention decisions to determine what kind of risk someone is of committing a crime. They're used for the correctional system in releasing offenders to have a sense of what kind of risk they may pose in terms of criminal reoffending, and also then providing tools for better community reentry. What it means is that those tools are currently not incorporating possibility of generational shifts. So they might have overpredict criminal offending and risks, especially among younger individuals who are born in more recent years.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our program, but we do have one more question. So if we could keep the answer brief, Magnus. But the question comes from Southern California, and it's, how have California criminal justice reforms affected the trends seen in this report, and how are they being accounted for?
Yeah, again, you know, these criminal justice reforms in California, we've looked at them for a number of years and following how they've affected a variety of outcomes. In this particular setting, they are likely to play less of a role given the measure that we're looking at here, violent felony offenses. So they haven't directly impacted those. It doesn't mean that they do not have an impact. The way that we are attempting to account for any such possible impacts is to make adjustments for these broader changes, what we call period effects. That's under the assumption that they are, if they have an impact, that they are roughly equal across age groups. So we're making efforts to address that both in terms of our methods, but also in our definition of criminal offending in this report.
Thanks. We've reached the end of our program. So once again, thank you, Magnus, for the presentation, and thank you for your help in responding to our audience questions. I'd also like to thank our funder for supporting today's program, and thank all of you for joining us online. If you pre-registered for today's program, you will receive a survey later today. We hope that you'll take the time to fill out that survey and let us know how we did. Once again, thank you and have a good afternoon.